somewhere on the far edge of the Valorian spiral, which is what the Galactic Accord calls the region of space we used to call home, because apparently naming rights go to whoever gets to the treaty table first. There exists a research archive so old that its original builders are listed in historical records simply as the ones who came before. Not very creative, those early civilizations, but efficient. The archive holds approximately 400,000 years of accumulated knowledge, cataloged species records, diplomatic transcripts, battle logs, and, buried deep in a subsection labeled Unverified Biological Phenomena, one particularly embarrassing entry. The entry reads, in rough translation, reported sighting of bipedal carbon-based life forms on a mid-tier oxygen world, third orbit from a yellow dwarf star, alleged to display advanced tool use, emotional complexity, and, inexplicably, voluntary entry into conflict situations, despite having no natural armor, no venom, no sonic capability, and a lifespan so short it barely registers on standard actuarial tables. Classification: mythological. Confidence level: low. Recommend no further investigation. That entry was filed approximately 6,000 years ago by a Dracian survey vessel that passed close enough to Sol to pick up faint radio signals, which at the time were a looping broadcast of something called a weather report, and then turned around and left, concluding that any species obsessing over precipitation was probably not worth the fuel expenditure. They were wrong, obviously. But we will get to that. The Galactic Accord, for those who need a quick orientation, is not a democracy. It is not a meritocracy. It is not even a particularly well-organized bureaucracy, though it has all the paperwork of one. It is more accurately a collection of 43 recognized species who found it less expensive to talk to each other than to keep blowing each other up, and who over several millennia developed a shared legal framework, a common trade currency, and a truly spectacular mutual loathing for the Keth Dominion. The Keth. Right. That is where the story actually starts. The Keth Dominion had been expanding for approximately 800 years by the time the events of this particular chapter unfolded. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They arrived, they assessed, and they consumed systems, populations, infrastructure, with the methodical patience of a species that had long ago solved the problem of individual mortality and replaced it with something far worse: collective immortality, and absolutely nothing left to fear. Every Keth soldier was grown, not born. Every commander was a copy of a copy of a copy of a tactical intelligence that had not lost a ground engagement in 2 centuries. They did not have families. They did not have art. They had, as near as xenobiologists could determine, one driving instinct: more. The Accord had been fighting them, or more accurately, retreating from them in an organized fashion and calling it strategic repositioning, for 60 years. 60 years of losing systems. 60 years of evacuation convoys and refugee processing and emergency sessions and resolutions that resolved nothing. The Accord's military, the combined fleet, was not incompetent. They were outmatched. There is a difference, though it rarely feels like one when your ships are on fire. Admiral Vis Olin, commanding officer of the combined fleet's 3rd engagement group, understood this distinction intimately. She was Tharkon, which meant she had 4 arms, exceptional spatial reasoning, and a cultural tradition of understatement so deeply ingrained that when her flagship, the Enduring Patience, lost its forward shields over the Mirren Belt and her tactical officer said the situation was, quote, somewhat unfavorable, she understood that to mean they were approximately 9 minutes from total hull failure. Pull us back to the secondary line, she said, and get me a count on what we have left. What they had left, her second-in-command Braille reported with the careful tone of someone delivering bad news to a person holding a weapon, was 43% of their original complement. The Keth assault formation had adapted, again. Every time the combined fleet developed a counter to a Keth tactic, the Keth integrated the counter into their own strategy within 3 engagements. They learned, they updated, they iterated. Fighting them was like arguing with a wall that kept rearranging itself to anticipate your next argument. The Accord Council is requesting an update, Braille added. Tell them we are reassessing our tactical position. That is what I told them 40 minutes ago. Then tell them we are still reassessing. We are very thorough. The battle over Miran Belt was not the worst engagement of the war, but it was the one that finally broke something in the Accord's collective confidence. The last quiet understanding that if they just held long enough, something would change. Because after Miran Belt, the Keth held the approach lanes to 4 core systems. 3 more, and they reached Tharkin Prime. 6, and they reached the Accord's central hub at Valorian Station. The math was not complicated. The math was, in fact, catastrophic. It was in this context, the Accord bleeding, the fleet halved, the Council holding emergency sessions every 36 hours, that a signal arrived. Not a Keth signal, not a distress call, a diplomatic introduction, which was, given the timing, either the best-timed thing in galactic history or the most absurd. The signal originated from a set of coordinates that corresponded, in the old survey archives, to a yellow dwarf system in the uncontacted buffer zone. The region of space the Accord had officially designated as pending evaluation for the last 3,000 years, which was a polite way of saying not worth the paperwork. The signal was transmitted in 17 languages simultaneously, including 3 that the Accord considered dead, which suggested whoever sent it had done their research. The content, once decoded, was brief. This is the Terran Interstellar Assembly. We have been listening to your war for 11 years. We would like to talk. Silence on the bridge of Valorian Station's communications hub lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Ambassador de la Voss, who handled first contact protocols for the Accord, and who had, in 30 years of service, never actually used those protocols, because the last new species to make contact had done so 8 decades ago, pulled up the survey archive entry on the coordinates. She read it twice. She looked at the confidence level rating, she looked at the mythological classification, she set down her datapad and said, very quietly, "Oh." The debate in the council lasted 6 hours. There were arguments against engagement. The signal could be a Keth deception. The species was unvetted. The timing was suspicious. First contact during active warfare violated 17 separate Accord protocols. There were arguments for engagement. They were losing, they were desperate, and frankly, at this point, if a mythological species wanted to talk, the Accord had very little to lose by listening. The deciding vote came from Vis Olan, who had been patched into the session from the enduring patience while her engineers were still welding the secondary hull. When the floor came to her, she said simply, "Send them a meeting request. I have been strategically repositioning for 2 months. I would like to try something different." The meeting was arranged at a neutral waypoint, a decommissioned way station in the buffer zone, chosen because it was defensible, equidistant, and had functional life support for at least 4 species atmospheres. The Accord sent 3 representatives. Vis Olan, because she was the ranking military officer and someone had to be. Ambassador de la Voss, because first contact was technically her job. And a Dracian historian named Oren Call, because the council thought it would be useful to have someone present who could verify whether these beings matched any historical records, and also, honestly, because Oren had been asking loudly to be included since the signal arrived, and it was easier to say yes than to keep explaining why not. What arrived on the other side of the docking corridor was not what any of them expected. They had reviewed what little data existed. The old survey entry, some electromagnetic emissions analysis, a handful of intercepted transmissions that had drifted toward Accord space over the centuries. They had assembled from these fragments a rough picture. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, atmospheric breathers, apparently social, fine, normal enough. What the data had not conveyed was the way 3 of them walked through the airlock with the particular loose-limbed ease of beings who were entirely comfortable in a foreign environment and intended to let you know it. What the data had not conveyed was the way the one in front, a female, medium height, with brown skin and dark eyes and the kind of posture that communicated authority, the way a transmission tower communicates signal, just constantly and in all directions, looked around the waystation's meeting room, clocked each of the 3 Accord representatives in roughly 2 seconds, and then smiled. Orrin Call would later note in his official record that the smile was disarming in a way he could not fully quantify. It communicated friendliness, he wrote, but also the faint suggestion that she already knew how this was going to go, and had decided it was going to go in her favor. The human's name was Commander HFY Adeyemi. She introduced herself, introduced her colleagues, Lieutenant Pasha Marenko, who was tall and quiet and kept glancing at the structural supports in the ceiling in the way of someone professionally trained to identify load-bearing weakness, and Dr. Sung-Ha Yoon, who had a portable scanner clipped to her belt and was already taking atmospheric readings. And then, she said something that no Accord diplomat had ever said in an opening session. "We've mapped your front lines. We know where the Keth are thin. Can we skip to the part where we talk about the actual problem?" De La Voss blinked. She had prepared 17 pages of standard first contact preamble. She set it aside. Yes, we can do that." What followed was 3 hours of the most direct military briefing Vis Olin had experienced in her career. Not because the humans were rude, they weren't, but because they operated at a pace and with a specificity that felt almost aggressive after years of Accord council sessions. HFY Adeyemi asked questions that cut to the operational core every time. She interrupted politely but consistently whenever the answer drifted toward diplomacy. She drew tactical annotations on the shared display with the casual confidence of someone who had been studying this war not as an observer, but as a participant who had not yet arrived. "Your problem isn't firepower," she said, near the end of the first hour. "Your combined fleet has sufficient tonnage. Your problem is adaptation rate. The Keth are updating their tactics faster than your command structure can respond." "We are aware of the problem," Vis Olin said, dry as Tharkan desert sand. "Right. We have some thoughts on that." Orrin Call, who had been quiet for most of the briefing, raised one of his 4 hands. "Forgive the interruption, but how? You are a single-planet species with no recorded interstellar engagement history. The confidence level on your survey file was, and I want to be accurate here, extremely low. How do you have thoughts on a 60-year war you were not present for?" HFY looked at him with an expression that was, he would later struggle to describe, not offended, not amused, but somewhere in the vicinity of a professor who has been asked a question by a student who is going to feel slightly foolish about it later. "We weren't in the war," she said, "but we've been in wars, a lot of them, for a very long time." She paused. "We've been adapting to tactical opponents since before your survey file was written. We lost, sometimes. We lost badly, sometimes. And then we figured out what we'd done wrong and we tried again." She glanced at the tactical display, at the line of Keth Advance, at the slow red tide of lost systems. "We're very good at figuring out what we did wrong." Vis Olin studied her for a long moment. Outside, through the waystation's viewport, the buffer zone stretched dark and quiet. A region of space the Accord had written off, had filed as pending, had simply never gotten around to. "What are your terms?" the Admiral asked. HFY Adeyemi smiled again. This time, Orrin noted, it was slightly different, less diplomatic, more like something with teeth. "We'll get to that," she said. "First, let me show you what we brought." What they had brought, as it turned out, was not a diplomatic gift basket. The hangar bay of the waystation was not large. It had been designed for shuttle storage and light cargo transfers, not military assessment, but Pasha Marenko had apparently decided that the distinction was not his problem, because when the blast doors rolled back, the room beyond was occupied by something that made Vis Olin stop walking. It was a ship. Or rather, it was the front quarter of a ship, because the rest of it extended back through the docking collar and out into open space, which meant the portion visible inside the hangar was roughly the size of a combined fleet cruiser's bridge section, and the full vessel was considerably longer than that. It was not elegant. Accord warship design philosophy tended toward hydrodynamic forms, smooth lines, the aesthetic of something built to move through resistance. This ship looked like it had been designed by someone who considered resistance a personal challenge. Angular, dense, covered in what appeared to Dila Voss's untrained eye to be an absolutely unreasonable number of external weapon housings. That, said Dr. Sung Ha-yoon, with the particular pride of someone showing off a project they have been working on for years, is the TIA Relentless. She's our third-generation deep engagement vessel. We have 9 more in the buffer zone and about 40 support craft. Oren Cal did a calculation. That is not a fleet. That is a squadron. It's a start, Ife said. Against the Keth Dominion, Oren continued, with the tone of a historian who has catalogued a great many military disasters and recognized the early chapters. A squadron is, statistically, Oren, Vis Olan said quietly. I am simply noting the numbers. The numbers, Ife said, without any particular heat, aren't the point. The point is what the ships do. She nodded at Pasha, who pulled up a tactical projection on the shared display. A recording, Vis realized, of an actual engagement. 3 weeks ago, a Keth patrol formation entered our outer detection range. Standard Keth advance unit, 12 assault carriers, 6 command ships, the usual escort complement. We engaged them with 2 vessels. She let that sit for a moment. 2, Oren repeated. 2, she confirmed. Engagement duration was approximately 40 minutes. Keth losses total. Our losses, 1 hull breach on the Relentless, Deck 4, no casualties. The crew sealed the section and kept fighting. She glanced at Vis. You asked earlier how we could have thoughts on a war we weren't present for. This is how. We tested our thoughts against actual Keth before this meeting. The recording played. Vis watched it twice. She had spent 60 years watching Keth tactical formations, had developed an intuitive sense for their movement patterns, their adaptation cycles, their predictive aggression. What she saw in the recording did not match any counter-doctrine in the combined fleet's library. The 2 human vessels did not engage the Keth formation from a distance. They went into it. Inside the formation's own coordination range, where Keth fire-linking protocols were designed to concentrate, and then they moved in ways that made VC's tactical brain perform a small, involuntary recalibration, because the Keth adaptive response, which she had seen iterate through 3 generations of combined fleet tactics in 60 years, was not working. Every time the Keth formation adjusted, the human ships had already moved, not because they had anticipated the adjustment, because they had provoked it deliberately and knew exactly where it would land. You're forcing the adaptation cycle, she said slowly. You're not countering their tactics. You're feeding them false patterns, making them adapt to something that isn't real, and then hitting them in the gap while their formation is mid-update. Ife pointed at her. There it is. How did you develop this? Long story, short version. We've been doing this to each other for about 10,000 years, just without the spaceships. She folded her arms. The Keth's greatest advantage is that they learn faster than their opponents. Our answer to that is not to slow their learning down. It's to make what they're learning wrong. Dila Voss, who had been quiet for some time, said, You want to join the combined fleet? We want to fight alongside the combined fleet, Ife corrected, and the distinction was, Vis noted, very deliberate. Not under, alongside, coordinated command structure, shared tactical data, mutual engagement authority. We bring the doctrine and the forward engagement. You bring the tonnage and the supply lines. And the terms? Vis asked. The second time she had asked, she had a feeling the answer was about to become interesting. Ife reached into the document case on the table, an actual physical document, printed on material that was not standard Accord fabrication stock, which meant they had prepared this before the meeting, which meant they had been prepared to make this offer before they knew whether the Accord would even take the meeting, which told Vis a number of things about how Ife Adeyemi thought, and slid a single sheet across the table. Vis read it. She passed it to Dila. Dila read it. She passed it to Oren. Oren read it, looked up and said, This is very short. We find long treaties create opportunities for creative misinterpretation, Ife said. The terms were, in fact, 4 points. Recognition of Terran sovereign space, defined by attached coordinates. No Accord vessels in Terran space without prior consent. Shared access to all Keth tactical data the Accord had accumulated in 60 years. And one final point, which was, when the war ended, not if, when, the phrasing was precise, the Accord would formally acknowledge humanity's full membership in the galactic community, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. You are certain the war will end, Oren said. We're certain we'll fight until it does, Ife said. Which is functionally the same thing, from a planning perspective. Vis Olin set down the document. She thought about Mirren Belt. She thought about 43% of her fleet. She thought about the red tide on the tactical map, and the systems behind it, and the 6 steps between here and Tharkin Prime. She thought about the survey file, mythological, confidence level low, and about the fact that 3 of the supposedly mythological beings were currently sitting across a table from her, in a decommissioned way station, having already destroyed a Keth patrol formation before the meeting started, apparently as a demonstration. I'll sign, she said. Pending council ratification. They'll ratify, Ife said. You're very confident. You're losing, Ife said simply. Not cruel, just honest. Confidence gets easier when you're the option that isn't losing. The council ratified in 11 hours. A record, Dyla noted, by approximately 4 days. What followed, over the next 8 months, was something that defied the Accord's standard frameworks for military documentation, because it didn't look like any campaign they had run before. It looked, their analysts kept noting, with increasing bewilderment, like it was working. The human squadron, which expanded quietly over the first month as more Terran vessels came through the buffer zone, until the squadron was 47 ships, and then 60, and then 80, which was when the Accord Council asked whether humanity had mentioned the full scope of its fleet capacity in any prior communication, and was told, diplomatically, that they had described it as a start, integrated with the combined fleet at the tactical coordination level, not the command level. Ife had been very clear about that distinction, and the clarity had been tested twice by combined fleet officers who believed rank was rank regardless of species origin, and both times Ife had responded with a precise, documented tactical objection that turned out to be correct, after which the testing largely stopped. The first joint engagement was at Kasiri Station, a resupply hub the Keth had taken 6 months prior and were using as a staging ground for the push toward the core systems. Combined fleet doctrine called for a siege formation, establish perimeter, cut supply lines, wait. Ife's recommended approach was what her tactical briefing described as, and Vis read this 3 times to make sure she had it right, an aggressive welcome. 12 human vessels entered the Keth defensive perimeter, at speeds the Keth fire control systems were not calibrated to track at close range. They fed the Keth formation 3 false tactical patterns in 8 minutes, each one designed to provoke a specific adaptive response, each response pulling Keth assets slightly out of position. Then the combined fleet hit the gaps. Then the human ships turned around and hit the Keth response to the combined fleet hitting the gaps. The engagement lasted 44 minutes. Kasiri Station changed hands for the second time. Lieutenant Pasha Mirenko, who turned out to be an architect of the false pattern doctrine as much as Ife, spent the post-engagement debrief drawing on every available flat surface and talking faster than the Accord's universal translator could comfortably keep pace with. Vis watched her own tactical staff trying to absorb it in real time. Some of them got it immediately. The rest got it by the 3rd engagement. The Keth, who were also watching, adapted, and then adapted to the wrong thing because Pasha had anticipated their adaptation, and the pattern they were chasing was not the pattern they were in. Oren Kall, who had somewhat unexpectedly become the combined fleet's informal xenobiologist in residence for human behavior, filed a research note around this time that circulated widely. It read in part, Humans have a concept they call playing chess. The game involves anticipating an opponent's moves several steps in advance. When I asked Commander Adeyemi whether the Keth engagement doctrine was based on this concept, she said, quote, "Sort of. Except in chess, your opponent also knows the rules. With the Keth, we get to write new rules every time." I have reviewed this statement multiple times and remain uncertain whether it is strategic insight or dangerous overconfidence. Current evidence suggests it is both, and that for humans this is not a contradiction. The Keth adapted. Of course they did. They always adapted. At the fourth joint engagement, they introduced a counter formation that neutralized 2 of the 3 false pattern types humanity had been running. Pasha spent 1 hour, 40 minutes locked in a tactical room with Dr. Yoon and 2 combined fleet strategists, Lena Var and Osik Tel, who had been learning the doctrine fastest. They came out with a 4th pattern type, then a 5th, the Keth Central Intelligence, which had spent 800 years iterating against opponents who had a fixed tactical library, was now iterating against opponents who were generating new material faster than the iteration cycle could complete. It was, Dr. Yoon noted cheerfully, like trying to update software while someone kept changing the programming language. Vis Olin, watching the tactical map shift from red to contested to, slowly, grudgingly, system by system, something closer to neutral, felt something she had not felt in 60 years of strategic repositioning. She did not name it immediately. She was Tharkan. Naming things before they were certain was considered impolite. But she felt it, the turning point, the moment that would end up in every historical archive, including the updated version of the one that had classified humans as mythological, came at the Keth's forward command nexus above the planet Veldura. The Keth had never lost a command nexus. They had never needed to defend one, because nothing in the combined fleet's arsenal had ever reached one. They were, their tactical models apparently assumed, unreachable by definition. Ife Adeyemi's after-action report for the Veldura engagement was 11 pages. Vis read all of it. The summary paragraph read, "We reached it, 41 human vessels, supported by combined fleet heavy tonnage, against the Keth's deepest defensive formation. The false pattern doctrine, by this point running through 6 generations of refinement. Pasha's team had spent 3 weeks specifically modeling the Keth Nexus defense protocols. They had identified 17 adaptation triggers, 17 specific tactical inputs that would cause the Keth defense formation to update, and they had sequenced them, not to counter the updates, to cause them in a specific order that left the Nexus exposed for a window of approximately 90 seconds at the end of the sequence. The combined fleet heavies hit the window, all of them, at once. The Veldura command Nexus went dark in 83 seconds. It took the Keth Dominion 19 days to formally request cessation of hostilities. The Accord Council spent 4 of those days debating whether the request was genuine, 12 days negotiating terms, and 3 days arguing about the wording of the announcement. Then they ratified the Veldura Accords, which ended a 60-year war in a document significantly shorter than anyone expected, partly because humanity's representative on the drafting committee kept removing what she described as decorative language that obscures the actual agreement. The formal recognition ceremony for Terran membership in the Galactic Accord was held at Valorian Station. Every recognized species sent a representative. Oren Qual delivered a short historical address. He spoke about the survey archive entry. He had pulled the original filing, the one with the low confidence rating and the mythological classification, and he read it aloud, and then he said, "We filed this 6,000 years ago because we listened to a weather report and assumed that was all there was. We were, I think you will agree, somewhat mistaken." Ife Adeyemi sat in the front row next to Pasha and Dr. Yoon, and approximately 30 other humans who had come to watch. She was not wearing her commander's uniform. She was wearing something simpler, still formal but different. When Oren finished speaking, and the room applauded in whatever way each species applied, she leaned over to Pasha and said something that the recording equipment, which was quite sensitive, happened to capture, she said. Took them long enough, and Pasha, who was quietly eating something he had brought from the food service at the back of the room, said, without looking up, "We were in the buffer zone for 11 years. I know. We sent them 140 signals before that one. I know. They classified us as mythological. I know." She paused. "We're in the room now." He considered this. Outside the station's viewports, the combined ships of the Galactic Accord and the Terran Interstellar Assembly held position together, angular human vessels beside sleek Tharkan cruisers, bulk Drassian carriers beside the fast response craft of a dozen other species, all of it quiet and present and real against the dark. "Yeah," Pasha said, "we are." Vis Olan, who was standing at the back of the room because she preferred to observe ceremonies from a position where she could also watch the exits, watched the humans in the front row and thought about the survey entry, and Mirren Belt, and 90 seconds over Veldura, and a tactical briefing that had started by skipping 17 pages of preamble. She thought about confidence levels. The Keth Dominion had, in its 800 years of expansion, never encountered a species it could not eventually out-adapt. What it had not accounted for, and what no one had accounted for, and what the archive entry with its low confidence rating had spectacularly failed to anticipate, was a species that had been practicing specifically this, adapting faster than the enemy, making the enemy adapt to the wrong thing, treating war as a problem with a solution rather than a condition to be endured. Since before the Accord had bothered to check whether they existed, 6,000 years to get from weather report to you're in the room. Honestly, Vis thought, watching Ife Adeyemi accept the formal recognition token from the council chair with the same expression she had worn walking through the airlock on the way station, like she already knew how this was going to go, that was pretty good time for a myth.